Hello, welcome back to my channel. It is lovely to have you here. My name is Grace and I talk about books and writing, and today I'm going to talk about every book that I have read thus far this year as of March the 21st. I have read 11 books so far this year, which for me is quite a lot. I'm very ahead of schedule and I'm going to just go through them chronologically by the order that I read them and have a little chat. This might be a reasonably long one, so I'd recommend getting comfy, getting yourself a beverage of some kind, hydrate yourself, and we're just going to talk about some books that I've read. Let's go. So the first book that I read this year, I technically started last year, but I finished it this year, and that is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. This is kind of a fantasy classic. This was originally published in 1968, and then there was a film, an animated film that was made based on this in like the 1980s, and I had been waiting for ages for this to come back into print in the UK. You could get a hold of it, but it was pretty difficult and they weren't very nice editions, and thankfully they reprinted it in a lovely new hardback, so I was very excited. However, I didn't dislike this book at all, and I really want you to take whatever I say with a reminder that this is just my opinion, because a lot of people love this book. It is considered a classic in the fantasy genre. This edition is actually prefaced by Patrick Rothfuss, who says that it's his favourite book ever. And I did enjoy it. The writing in here is really, really good. It reminded me, it's a bit Pratchett-esque, very witty, very funny, and the characters are quite nuanced. I should say, this is the story of a unicorn in a fantasy, very fairy tale-like land, where they find one day, just from overhearing the talk of some soldiers in their woods, that they are the last unicorn around, at least known to the general populace. And there used to be a lot of them. They're quite solitary creatures, so they don't see each other very often, but there used to be several unicorns about. So they decide to go on a quest to hunt down the rest of the unicorns and figure out what has happened to them and if they really are the last unicorn. And on the way, they meet some interesting characters. There's a wizard called Schmendrick. It feels quite tongue-in-cheek, the whole book, and it definitely plays on a lot of classic fantasy stories and tropes and pokes fun at them. And I did enjoy those things. There were times when this made me laugh or made me think, wow, that was clever, but I didn't find myself that connected to the characters, and I don't know if it was just because I had quite high expectations for this one. I find similar issues with some of Terry Pratchett's writing where I'm reading it and I'm thinking, this is so clever, this is so funny, but I'm not on that connected level with the characters. I'm not as invested as I would like to be. That's not always the case with Pratchett. I've read some of his books where I have been really invested, but some of them less so, and I found that same issue with this one. But again, that is my opinion. A lot of people absolutely adore this book, so please give it a try for yourself if you think it is your kind of thing. If you enjoy Pratchett's writing, I definitely say give this one a try. And also if you just enjoy kind of a quirky, funny take on a good fairy tale. So that is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. Next, I read a couple of books for a reading vlog that I did. Actually my first 24-hour reading vlog, but it was very wintry themed. So if you've seen that, you'll know what these are. But the first one is Mysteries of Thorn Manor by Margaret Rogerson. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, you've probably heard me rant about Margaret Rogerson. I adore her writing. I think she captures so much whimsy in her stories. And this is the sequel novella to Sorcery of Thorns by the same author. And I adored Sorcery of Thorns so much. Sorcery of Thorns is the story of a girl who works in a magical library where if the books are mistreated, they can turn into monsters. And one day, due to some kind of sabotage, one of the most dangerous books breaks free, and in her attempt to stop this rampaging grimoire, she is implicated in the crime and ends up being taken away by a mysterious and handsome sorcerer, of course. And I just adored that first book. It is very Howl and Sophie vibes from Howl's Moving Castle, and Margaret Rogerson is just so skilled at writing about morality that is very tricksy and not just black and white at all. She likes writing about those complicated characters who have good in them, even though they might be overall a little bit evil, or vice versa. And this was just a cute little sequel novella in which the two main characters try to host a ball, but the mansion that they're meant to be hosting this ball in is pulling some shenanigans, some magical shenanigans. And this was a lovely, easy read. I wouldn't say it was groundbreaking at all, but it was an enjoyable just continuation of their story. If you enjoyed Sorcery of Thorns, I definitely give this one a read. There's definitely no real high stakes in here. It doesn't begin a whole new story or plot arc, just a kooky little adventure, but it definitely showcases Margaret Rogerson's whimsy. And if you enjoy stories about a house that's kind of a character and causing mischief through magic, then that is very present in here. I really enjoyed that aspect. I wouldn't say that if this book didn't exist, I'd feel a big hole. I think Sorcery of Thorns could have stood on its own, but it was a good fun time. I'm not gonna complain. So that is Mysteries of Thorn Manor by Margaret Rogerson. The other book that I finished during that reading vlog was an audiobook, so I don't have it with me, though I have finally been able to order my own copy because they are publishing it in the UK, finally. But that is Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. Now this was my first T. Kingfisher book and I'm so glad that I gave it a go. I'm definitely going to read some more of T. Kingfisher's work in the future because I love the writing style in this book. This is a fantasy story where a paladin whose powers come from one specific god tries to figure out their life a few years after the death of that god. Since the purpose of their order was so wrapped up with this god's wishes, they don't really know what to do with themselves anymore, and they still have the lingering power left over from their connection with the god that doesn't really have anywhere to go, and worst case scenario can cause other people to be put in danger. And at first that sounds pretty grim, but really this was mostly a rom-com. This paladin ends up bumping into a perfumer called Grace, and when the two of them accidentally witness an assassination attempt, they end up wrapped up in this mystery together and also maybe kindling some feelings at the same time. This book was so charming. T. Kingfisher has such a grasp of comedy, which is such a difficult thing to write. I always find it so impressive when someone can write humour well, but this book made me laugh out loud on several occasions. And T. Kingfisher is really skilled at balancing dark with light. People's heads were washing up in rivers, and yet most of the time I was laughing. It was such a strange, stark comparison between dark things going on, but this lovely little romance and really quirky, funny characters. And I know that T. Kingfisher really likes balancing that line, walking that tightrope, because I know they write kind of cozy horror, but if you want more the cozy side, I definitely recommend Paladin's Grace, and then it becomes a series. There is Paladin's Strength, I think, is next, and then they continue and they tell the stories of side characters from the first book, which I'm so excited to get to because I adored the side characters in this story. I feel like romance stories can often suffer from the syndrome where the side characters just aren't really people. They're just there to serve the main plot and the main romance, but that wasn't the case here, I didn't feel. Both main characters had close friends that were featured in this story, and they were both really funny, but also quite interesting, and I'm interested to see where their stories might go in the future. This does end in a little bit of a cliffhanger, not in regards to the main characters of this story, but another aspect of the plot isn't quite wrapped up and can then continue through the rest of the series, I assume, but with new characters being focused on. So you can kind of read this as a standalone, but be warned that if you want to fully finish the plot, you may then have to read the rest of the series. But either way, if you want a fantasy romance that's really going to make you laugh a lot, then I highly recommend Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher. The next book I read is a sequel, which I would love to talk about, but unfortunately I can't because it was published by St. Martin's Press, who we online are still boycotting because of the discriminatory actions of one of their members of staff, especially within social media. I'll link some information down below that will be able to explain it much better than I can, but basically they've made anti-Palestinian posts on their social media and been very uninclusive when it comes to sending out proofs and interacting with social media influencers of colour. So until the time that they respond to some very reasonable requests, the boycott is asking that we online don't talk about the books that they publish. It's not a ban on readers, you can still buy the books and read them and enjoy them, but seeing as the issue is online and in the social media space, we've been hoping that not promoting any of these books in social media will get through to them eventually. But anyway, I'll link some information down below, but that is why I won't be talking about that book right now. Hopefully in the future I might be able to, but we'll see. So the next book that I can talk about is a book that I read for Valentine's, for a little Valentine's reading vlog, so you may recognise it if you watch that video, which is Girl Goddess Queen by B. Fitzgerald. This is a young adult retelling of the story of Hades and Persephone, but with a very feminist spin on it. In this version, Persephone wasn't taken to Hades. She decided to go of her own free will and uses her power that she slowly begins to discover throughout the story to find her new place in the world, which the ancient Greek world was pretty awful. If you consider the actions that gods like Zeus got away with all the time, it was a pretty rough place to be. This is also a bit of an enemies to lovers romance. It's sort of an enemies to friends to lovers. And it was marketed to me as a rom-com, which I wouldn't necessarily describe this as. I think the romance definitely was on the back burner in this one. It is there, but it takes a long time in the story to even begin to develop. That's not really what this story is about. It's more about the story of Corey, who later will become Persephone. It's not a spoiler, we all know that this is about Persephone, but it's about her taking her own life into her hands and figuring out what she wants for herself and her own power. I did enjoy this story. I went into it thinking that it was something that it wasn't, so I found it a little bit difficult to adjust to what I was actually reading, what I was expecting, just a good fun romance. I think that if you went into it knowing that this is far more a feminist story of claiming your own power, then you might enjoy it more if you were actively looking for that. And then the romance is a little bit of an afterthought. It was lovely when it got there, but it wasn't the main part of the story at all. I have mixed feelings about this one. I did enjoy it and I can see what it was doing, but I think I can't tell how much of my slight disconnect from the characters comes from the writing and how much of it comes from just my expectations not being right for the book. I did really enjoy the discussions in here of things like consent. That was very clearly talked about in here, and also really complicated family dynamics. Corey's mother is in some ways really not a great mother at all, but in the circumstances she's been given, she's doing her best. So it's quite a complex look at motherhood, especially in a very patriarchal society where there are much greater threats that she has to protect her daughter from. I would say maybe look up the trigger warnings for this one. There's nothing brutal in there at all really on the page, but it does discuss some heavier themes, especially considering that this is a young adult novel. But if you really like feminist retellings of Greek mythology, then I definitely give this one a try. Just don't go into it expecting just a rom-com like I did. That's not what this is at all. But that is Girl Goddess Queen by B. Fitzgerald. The next book that I read also for that Valentine's reading vlog is actually my boyfriend's favourite book probably ever, and that is The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy by Megan Bannen. This is an enemies to lovers romance between a zombie hunter and an undertaker who fall in love through writing anonymous letters to each other not realizing that they're actually talking to their greatest enemy. This is set in a really interesting fantasy world where they have some of the technology that we have, though it's slightly shifted. It's a very water-based world, so instead of cars, they have auto ducks, which will then travel along water highways. It's really good fun and very playful in its world building. One of the things that I enjoyed the most about this, despite it being a romance heavy story, is the way that the world building is delivered in little morsels to you. It's not dumped on you at all, but you slowly begin to piece things together, and it's almost like you're solving a little mystery as you read, but you never feel confused in a frustrated way, or at least I didn't. This is a reasonably spicy read. The romance in here is quite lusty, I'd say, and the actual love and relationship probably comes a little bit after. The author is very upfront about the fact that these two characters are very attracted to each other. In the beginning, quite infuriatingly so, because neither of them want to be. But again, all of the side characters in here are really interesting. I think my favourite character in here was actually one of the side characters. The zombie hunter took on an apprentice, and I loved him so much. He is probably the sweetest man I've ever read about. Also really funny. This book again made me laugh several times. The only thing I will say is that there was a moment at the end, a bit of the resolution of the story that I thought could have been written a little bit better. It felt a little bit contrived, and I think with just like a few minor tweaks it could have worked a lot better. So that was a little bit frustrating, but it didn't take away from the fact that I really enjoyed this story overall. And as a writer myself, I will definitely be rereading and trying to dissect the world building aspects of this story to try and learn from them, because I thought they were just so well done, the way that the world was explained to you. But I would definitely recommend this one if you enjoy a really funny romance fantasy with a little bit of a macabre twist and some zombies thrown in. So that is The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy by Megan Bannen. The next book that I read has been on my TBR for quite a while now, but I've barely heard anyone talking about it online. I think I saw it in a list of sapphic fantasy books one time a few years back, but since then I haven't really heard anyone talking about it, and that is The Misadventures of an Amateur Naturalist by Ceinwen Langley. I think that's how you say their name. This was a strange one. This is a sapphic retelling of Beauty and the Beast, where the main character longs to be a naturalist and hopes to go to the Exposition Universelle. I'm so sorry for my French, but it's this big convention for naturalists in Paris in 1867. So this is set in the 1800s. But when, to save her family from ruin, she is kind of forced into an engagement that she doesn't want to be in, she ends up running away and trying to make it to this convention herself, but the elements overtake her and she shelters in a mansion where a strange beast lurks who she decides to study. Now, you would think that all of that introduction would happen in the introduction part of the story, but we didn't meet the love interest until over halfway through the book. There was a very sweet love story in here when we finally got to it, but this was a lot more about the main character's wish to become a naturalist and her trying to escape the rules that society was trying to enforce upon her. And even though it was structurally very odd and not really what it was sold to me as, I still really enjoyed this one. It's a strange one looking back, because it probably could have been structured better, and really those things probably should have happened in an introductory part of the story. We should have maybe gotten to like a third of the way in at most by the time the main character found herself with the beast character. But I don't know if it was just because I listened to this on audiobook and the narrator did a gorgeous French accent and it was just so easy to listen to, but I was really swept away by this one and the French setting and the history of it. And even though it wasn't giving me what I had expected, I was still having a fun time. It was a very easy read. I would still recommend this one, but I wouldn't recommend it as the way that it is described. Again, if you would like a French historical novel about a girl trying to understand her wishes to not be ultra feminine and to not be with a man during those times, then you'll probably enjoy this one. And then the fantasy element and the romance is a little bit of an afterthought later in the story. I would recommend the audiobook because the narrator was wonderful for this one, but it probably could have been paced and structured better, especially for the way that this was blurbed and sold to me. So a bit of a strange one, but I still had a really good time, so take from that what you will. That is The Misadventures of an Amateur Naturalist by Ceinwen Langley. The next book that I finished, I took a while to read this one, so I had started it a bit earlier, but the next book is Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. I did enjoy this one. The length of the reading process for me was more because I was reading other things for different videos. This story is set in a world in which the gods have fallen in battle to the king several years ago now, and god-killers roam the lands, killing off any fledgling new gods that are trying to pop up or any that are left over from that fallen era. Our main character, Kissen, is a god killer. We begin the story with a flashback kind of prologue of her family being killed by zealots of a fire god and of her losing part of her leg in that process as well. The way that the prologue is written is a little bit different to the rest of the story, so if you're unsure about that writing style in the prologue, I would definitely say stick through it and get to the rest of the book because it's a bit more flowery and lyrical in that beginning section, and it gets a lot easier to read during the rest of the story. So Kissen is now a god killer, but one day she comes across a girl called Inara who is a young noble and a god called Skedi who is attached to her. This is what Skedi looks like. They're a little rabbit with wings and antlers, but somehow the two of them have become attached in a way that if one of them is hurt, the other one will also be hurt. So Kissen cannot kill this god. She wants to try to find a way to separate them. And then there's the added aspect of the two of them being on the run from unknown assassins. This is written in 4 different perspectives. So one is the god killer, one is the girl, one is the little god Skediseth, or Skedi, and the other one is a knight of the king who has retired and become a baker because he was quite disillusioned by some of the choices that the king made. And I often find with stories where they're written from multiple perspectives, there are some that you prefer over others and you're kind of waiting through the ones you like less to get to one that you find more interesting. But with this one, I did enjoy all of the perspectives. I found Skedi especially very interesting, the little god, because obviously their voice is going to be very different to a human's. I will say that this overall was a bit slow to start off with. I think it could have maybe been paced a little bit better, but at the same time all of the characters were interesting enough to pull me through that initial slowness. And also the amount of diversity and disability representation in here was really great. That's often put aside in fantasy, which is so strange because a lot of the time in these fantasy settings there are wars and a lot more danger than we might have in our modern setting, so it would make a lot more sense if quite a few characters in every story had some kind of disability. So it was great to see that here. I think overall I wasn't obsessed with this, but I did enjoy it enough that I will definitely be finishing the series unless I hate the second one for some reason. This is a trilogy, by the way. But if you enjoy gods and the discussion of their power and morality in your fantasy stories, then this is definitely a great one for that. And if you enjoy gruff female main characters and softer male main characters, this is also great representation for that. So that is Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. The next book that I read really snuck up on me. I hadn't planned to read it, but I saw a recommendation for it online. It was getting some hype, and it was also free on an audiobook app that I use, and that is Those Who Wait by Hayley Cass. This is a chunky sapphic romance book. I think that the physical book is over 600 pages, so it really is a big one for the romance genre, and this was a lot spicier than I normally read. I don't mind a little bit of spice here and there, but this was quite a bit. But at the same time, the romance was definitely there as well. The basic plot of this one is that one of our main characters is a pretty self-assured lesbian, except she's not really out to the public because she is in politics. She's trying to get a new, pretty prominent job in politics and one day work her way up to hopefully become president of the United States. So it's kind of hard enough to do that being a woman, never mind openly gay. And the other main character is a very new baby bisexual and trying to figure out how to talk to women, has never dated a woman before, and they end up on a dating app through the mischief of one of their friends trying to get them out there and talking to this very confident lesbian politician. And initially it's sort of a mentor-student relationship almost, where one character is teaching the other how to talk to women, what to avoid, especially if you're looking for a more serious relationship and not just a hookup on this dating app. But they develop a friendship along the way and an attraction and maybe some feelings. I did really enjoy this one. This book made me cry on the bus, so I did have some issues with it, definitely. I don't know the background of this book, but I think that it wasn't as well edited as it could have been. I mean, it could have just been the audiobook that I was listening to, but there were several moments where things weren't grammatically correct or there was a typo, something that threw me off a little bit. But that didn't detract from my enjoyment of the story in general. One thing that did a bit is that this definitely suffered from that syndrome of the side characters not really being characters of their own, especially the female side characters, which was frustrating. A lot of them felt like they didn't really have much of a life outside of their influence on this main romance, and we didn't hear about their own relationships or their own worries, which you would in a normal friendship, so that was strange. But I did really enjoy the relationship between the main two characters, and the difficulties they were going through did feel realistic to me. Obviously it was a little bit idealistic because it was dealing with a slightly fantasized version of America in which we'd already had a female president. And there was discussion of discrimination against gay people in America, but probably quite watered down. I would say this was definitely an optimistic view, which is probably what you want out of a romance book. You know, you don't want it to be too heavily delving into the inequality in the US. I did really appreciate that this book was not shying away from the fact that one of the main characters was a lesbian in the slightest. That can happen in sapphic romance books, strangely enough. A lot of them can kind of either make the main two characters bisexual, which is totally fine of course, but it happens a lot more in fiction than in real life, and it's a lot rarer that authors will openly say that one of their main characters is a lesbian. That word is definitely shied away from when it is not a bad word. It's definitely not one of the best books I've read, but if you're looking for a proper hefty sapphic romance that you can sink your teeth into, then I would definitely give this one a read. So that is Those Who Wait by Hayley Cass. After that, I read my first non-fiction book of the year, finally, and that was Strong Female Character by Fern Brady. This has been reasonably popular in the UK, but I haven't seen it online too much. This is the biography of a Scottish comedian called Fern Brady, who is autistic but was not diagnosed as autistic until quite late in her adult life. So this is the story of her life kind of up until that point and a little bit after her diagnosis, of looking back at the way that she was treated growing up and the way that the medical system consistently misdiagnosed her, largely because she was a woman with autism, whereas she might have been diagnosed if she'd been a man with autism. Also the way that her family treated her, the way that she was treated in the comedian circle. It really doesn't hold back on a lot of the brutal things that she's been through, but at the same time, it's very sharp and funny at times, which you would expect from a comedian, I suppose. It feels like it's coming to light quite recently through social media in recent years, the way in which women are so heavily underdiagnosed for autism, the way that it can present in different ways in women, especially to the quite archaic research that has been used up until too recently. But even beyond that, I think this kind of delves into the sides of autism that maybe some people don't find pretty enough to put online. I think there are definitely some things that are even now more or less socially acceptable to talk about, and Fern doesn't pull any punches there. She talks about her meltdowns and how they've kind of ruined her adult life, and she talks about going to a mental facility as a young adult, and she talks about some of the pretty awful things that her family did to her through really misunderstanding the way that she was acting and seeing it as her acting out and trying to be a really bad child rather than her just trying to cope with the world around her as best she could. It also discusses her time stripping while she was at university in Edinburgh in a really interesting light, because it talks about how stripping as a job almost means that you can unmask in a way, because there are fewer social constraints at a strip club than there would be, say, if you were being a waitress. This was really, really fascinating, and I would definitely recommend it, especially if you are autistic yourself, or if someone in your life is, or just generally if you would like to know more about autism and the way that it is terribly underdiagnosed in women in the UK, and I'm pretty sure most other countries as well. It is quite a balance of heaviness and comedy in here. I'd maybe look up the trigger warnings for this one because it does get quite heavy and it's written quite bluntly. It definitely doesn't sugarcoat anything, and it is a little bit strange because it doesn't feel like a classic narrative, which of course biographies often can't because they're people's lives and they're not controllable in the way that a story is. You can't weave those threads together in the same way, but this does feel quite open-ended because it's clearly a journey that Fern is still going through, and she's still learning about herself. She's still trying to figure out how she fits in the comedy circuit with her autism and how to deal with her meltdowns. So it doesn't necessarily feel like it has a satisfying conclusion, but of course that's kind of the point, that these are still things in our modern society that really need to be worked on, and hopefully this book in a way can help our understanding at least to grow a little bit in the UK and maybe further afield as well. So very informative, pretty funny at times, a bit heavy. I would warn you on that one, but I would definitely recommend if you would like to learn more about this area, Strong Female Character by Fern Brady. And the final book I've read so far this year is another audiobook, and that is the first in a duology, The Stolen Heir by Holly Black. I finally read the Cruel Prince series at the end of last year and I was obsessed with them. I sped through those books faster than I have read any series in recent years, and I knew that I wanted to read The Stolen Heir this year. The sequel has just come out as well, and I actually started listening to that one this morning, which probably tells you that I really enjoyed this one. It was quite different to The Cruel Prince, but I didn't mind that. I kind of knew going in that it would be quite a different story. It wouldn't be as politically focused. It would be a lot more of kind of a quest narrative, but I really appreciated that. I think that a writer having range like that is impressive and should be celebrated. I know that some people went into this just wanting another Cruel Prince because they enjoyed The Cruel Prince so much, which I understand, but I was worried that the main character would just be kind of a Jude Mark II, and they definitely weren't. They weren't quite as clever and cunning as Jude was. They had their moments, but it was a lot more of kind of an animalistic cunning because they'd grown up pretty feral for the last few years. They've been living in the woods. For more context, this tells the story of a character who features in The Cruel Prince, but they're not a main part at all, and this is set, I think, about 7 or 8 years after the events of The Cruel Prince. I would definitely recommend reading that series first because this is going to spoil that series for you. And also, I don't think you'll care quite as much if you haven't read the initial series first. Some of those characters feature again and you just have a bit more of a connection to them already if you've read the initial trilogy. But this is the story of Ceinwen, who is a queen but has run away from fairyland and is living in the woods by her old human family's house. We find out at the beginning of this book that she was raised with humans for the first, I think about 7 or 8, again, years of her life, at which point she was taken away by her fae parents to become the figurehead of their plot against the crown, basically. But now she's living pretty feral in the woods. She's trying to break little curses here and there that fae have put on humans just to get back at fairyland wherever she can. But at the beginning of the story, the Prince of Elfhame comes to find her to take her on a quest that I won't tell you too much about because I don't want to spoil the original series. Please read it, it's so good. I really enjoyed this main character. I thought she was so interesting. I loved Jude as a main character in the initial series because she was so smart and cunning and ruthless. But I was, like I said, worried that we just get another version of Jude here, and we definitely didn't. This main character was brutal and feral and would lash out, but it was in this kind of instinctual distrust that she just has for the world around her because of what she's been through. But internally, she's kind of a softie. She really wants love, and that is her driving force. And I think after reading quite a few books with main female characters who were pretty edgy, their driving force was maybe power instead of love, it was nice to have that softness back as a variation. I also really enjoyed the prince as a character. He was so charming, but also quite slippery and hard to pin down what his motives were or what he was really thinking at any given time. I think that Holly Black is just so good at weaving plots together, and the fact that the Fae cannot lie is a big part of these stories, and because of that it almost feels like you're constantly trying to solve a riddle to figure out if there could be another way that certain words could be construed, or if someone phrased something strangely, did they mean something different? Because they can't lie, but they can be smart about the way that they say things. I just think she's really clever, and I'm really interested to see where this duology goes in the second book. I have just started it, and I hadn't realised before that it's written from the prince's perspective this time around. One book is written from the perspective of each main character, so I think that's going to be really interesting, especially because he was such a perplexing and mystifying character in the first book. It's going to be so interesting to read his real thoughts. So I will definitely be updating you on my thoughts when I finish the entire series. But if you like fae stories, or even if you just like riddles, I would so recommend the Cruel Prince series first and then the Stolen Heir duology. So that is The Stolen Heir by Holly Black. And that is all of the books that I have read so far this year. Just some statistics before I go. So far this year I have read 1 biography, 1 contemporary romance, and the other 9 were fantasies of some variety. And the one that surprised me the most, 8 out of these 11 books I have listened to on audiobook. I knew that it was quite a few, but I didn't realise it was that many. I wasn't really into audiobooks that much until last year, but I have found that they have allowed me to read so much more than I normally would because I can multitask, and also because I get really snoozy when I read. A lot of the time recently I have found myself just falling asleep. I cannot read for a long period of time without falling asleep anymore. I don't know what that's about. But if I can do something at the same time, I'm not going to fall asleep while I'm washing the dishes, let's say. So I am a big audiobook convert. I definitely think they are a big contributor to how many books I've read so far this year, in the fact that it is a lot more than I would usually read. And I will defend them till I die. Anything that means you can read more is a good thing in my books. No pun intended. So there we go. That is everything I've read so far and some little statistics on them. Let me know if you've read any of these books. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them, and let me know what your favourite read has been so far this year. I hope that you've had a really great reading year so far. So that is it for now. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you very soon in another video. Bye bye.